She held the ranch alone after her husband died. Then a wounded stranger collapsed at her gate. The horse came through the gate, with no rider sitting straight in the saddle. Margaret Wren heard the animal first, a hard, uneven sound in the dark beyond the kitchen window. It was not the steady trot of a neighbor coming late with news. It was not the tired walk of a loose ranch horse finding its way home. It was a panicked, broken rhythm, hooves striking frozen ground, leather creaking, metal rings shaking against the bit. She stood still beside the stove, one hand on the handle of the coffee pot, listening. Outside, the Wyoming wind moved across Red Lantern Ranch with a long, low moan. It pushed against the walls, rattled the loose pane over the sink, and made the hanging lantern sway above the table. The ranch house felt too quiet after that sound faded, the kind of quiet that had followed her everywhere since her husband had been buried on the hill behind the cottonwoods. Then the horse screamed. Margaret took down the rifle from above the door. She did not like holding it. She had never liked the cold weight of it in her hands. But a widow with 400 acres, a banknote due in spring, and a neighbor waiting like a wolf beyond the north fence did not get the comfort of disliking things. She only got the choice to survive them. She pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders and stepped out into the yard. The moon was thin, but the snow made the world bright enough to see. The barn stood black against the pale ground. The windmill turned with a slow, tired complaint. Near the front gate, her bay mare, Juniper, danced back from a stranger's horse that had stumbled halfway through the opening and stopped there, blowing steam through its nose. A man lay in the dirt beneath it. For one breath, Margaret did not move. The man was on his side, one boot still caught in the stirrup, his dark coat twisted under him. His hat had fallen a few feet away. His right hand was empty. A revolver sat at his hip, plain as day in the moonlight, but he made no move toward it. That told her something. A dangerous man might lie still to trick her. A desperate man might be too weak to raise a hand. But a man with a pistol near his fingers who did not reach, for it was either dying or trying not to frighten the only soul who might help him. Margaret kept the rifle ready anyway. "Can you hear me?" she called. The man's eyes opened. Even from several steps away she saw the pain in them, not wild, not drunk, not empty, just pain held tight behind a face that looked used to not asking for mercy. "Ma'am," he said, voice rough as gravel, "I mean you no harm." "Then keep your hands where I can see them." He gave the smallest nod, gladly. His head fell back against the ground. Margaret moved closer, slow and careful. The snow around his shoulder was dark, too dark. She had seen that kind of stain once before, on the sleeve of her husband's coat after the stampede that took him. Her chest tightened so sharply she nearly stepped back. "No, not now." "What happened to you?" she asked. "Ryder came up behind me," he said, did not stop to introduce himself. "Were you being chased by the law?" A faint, tired smile touched his mouth and vanished. "If I was, ma'am, I reckon I'd have picked a louder horse." It was not an answer. Margaret noticed that. She noticed everything now. 18 months earlier, she might have been softer. She might have run for water first, questions later. She might have believed a man because he looked wounded and spoke politely. But 18 months of running a frontier ranch alone had burned many gentle habits out of her. It had taught her that pity could open a door trouble walked through. It had taught her that men like Silas Voss did not always come with raised fists or shouted threats. Sometimes they came with contracts, smiles, missing cattle, cut fences, and neighbors who suddenly forgot what they had seen. She knelt near the stranger and pressed 2 fingers to his neck. "Alive, weak but alive." "What is your name?" she asked. "Eli," he said after a pause. "Eli Ransom." The pause was small. Margaret heard it. Still, she pulled her apron loose, folded it hard, and pressed it against the wound high in his shoulder. The man's jaw clenched, but he did not curse. His left hand dug into the frozen dirt until his knuckles paled. "You have a bullet in you, Mr. Ransom. I was afraid you'd say that. You have somewhere to go." "No. Someone coming after you." His eyes shifted toward the road beyond her gate. That was answer enough. The wind rose again, sweeping loose snow over the yard. The horse stamped and tossed its head. Somewhere in the barn, one of the cattle lowed, restless and deep. Margaret looked toward the northern dark, where Voss Ridge lay beyond the creek and the cottonwoods. Silas Voss had wanted Red Lantern Ranch from the week after her husband died. He had wanted the water, the railroad access, and the lower pasture her husband had spent 10 years clearing with his own hands. And for 18 months he had been patient. Too patient. Fence posts loosened. A calf found dead near the wash. A lone officer in Cheyenne suddenly writing colder letters than before. Men in town speaking to her with their eyes lowered, as if even kindness might cost them something. Now a wounded stranger had come through her gate. And for reasons she could not yet explain, Margaret felt that the night had not brought trouble to her ranch. It had brought trouble that was already looking for her. She looked down at Eli Ransom. His face had gone gray, but his eyes were open, watching her with a quiet shame that struck her harder than fear. "I can leave," he whispered. "Just water and I'll be gone before morning." "You cannot sit a horse." "I have done worse." "I do not doubt that." Margaret tightened the apron against his shoulder, "but not from my yard." His eyes searched her face. "You do not know me." "No," she said, "and I do not trust you." A bitter breath left him, almost a laugh. "But I will not let a man bleed to death at my gate." She stood, went to his horse, and freed his trapped boot from the stirrup. The animal shifted, nervous, but she spoke softly until it stilled. Then she bent and hooked one arm under Eli's good shoulder. He tried to help. The effort nearly broke him. "Easy," she said. "I'm sorry. Save your strength. I did not mean to bring this to your door." Margaret stopped for half a breath. Those were not the words of a man caught in a simple shooting over cards or debt. Those were the words of a man who knew danger had followed him and hated himself for where it had landed. She looked toward the road again. The moonlit ruts beyond the gate were empty, but the emptiness did not comfort her. It felt watched. With great effort, she dragged him toward the barn instead of the house. Not because she was cruel, but because she had survived too much to put an unknown man under her roof before sunrise. She laid him on clean straw in the back stall, brought water, whiskey, bandages, and the small sewing kit she hated seeing in her hands. The bullet had passed through. That was mercy. But the bleeding had not stopped. Eli gripped the edge of the blanket while she worked. Sweat shone on his forehead. Once, when her fingers brushed an old scar beneath his collarbone, he flinched in a way that had nothing to do with the wound. Margaret saw it. She said nothing. When the bandage was finally tied, she sat back on her heels, hands red, breath shaking in the cold barn air. Eli turned his face toward her. "Why help me?" The question sounded honest. Margaret looked at the lantern between them. Its flame bent each time the wind slipped through the barn boards, but it did not go out. "Because once," she said quietly, "my husband was brought home hurt and no one could save him." Eli's face softened, just enough to show he understood grief even if he did not know hers. Before he could answer, a sound came from outside. Not wind. Not cattle. Hooves. Margaret reached for the rifle lying beside the stall. Eli's hand caught her sleeve, weak but urgent. His eyes were wide now, fully awake despite the blood he had lost. "Mrs. Wren," he whispered, "if any man asks, I was never here." Margaret stared at him as the rider stopped beyond her gate. And in that moment, she knew the stranger had not only carried a bullet onto her land. He had carried a secret powerful enough to make a wounded man fear being found more than he feared dying. The rider at the gate did not call out at first. That silence troubled Margaret more than a shout would have. A decent traveler announced himself. A neighbor gave his name. A man with honest business did not sit still beyond a widow's gate in the dark, letting his horse breathe white clouds into the winter air while the whole ranch held its breath around him. Margaret lifted the rifle and stepped away from the stall. Eli Ransom tried to rise behind her. Pain stopped him before he made it to one elbow. "Stay down," she whispered. "If it is who I think it might be, staying down will not help you. It will help me not have to carry you twice in one night." Even through his pain, his eyes flickered with something close to respect. Then his face tightened as another set of hooves shifted outside. Two riders, Margaret realized. Not one. She moved to the barn door and kept herself hidden in the dark gap between two boards. The lantern behind her threw a weak amber glow, not enough to show her face from outside, but enough to make the rifle barrel shine if she was careless. She lowered it slightly and looked through the crack. Two men waited near the gate. One sat tall and broad in the saddle with a fur collar turned up around his jaw. The other was leaner, younger, restless, his gloved hand tapping against his thigh as if he wanted something to happen and had not been given permission yet. The broad man leaned forward. "Mrs. Wren," he called at last, "cold night to be awake." Margaret knew that voice. "Silas Voss." She felt anger move through her before fear could settle. Voss never came at night unless he wanted the dark to do half his work for him. By daylight, he dressed his threats in manners. At night, he did not bother smoothing the edges as much. She opened the barn door only wide enough to step through, then pulled it behind her. "Mr. Voss," she said, "you are far from your own supper table." His smile showed pale beneath the brim of his hat. "A horse came through this way. Rider may have been hurt. Thought I'd be neighborly and ask." Margaret kept the rifle across her arm, pointed down but ready. "You often follow hurt men across other people's land." The younger rider shifted. Voss did not. "I follow trouble when it crosses my fence line." "This is my fence line. For now." The words hung between them, quiet and sharp. Margaret's hands tightened on the rifle. She could feel the cold through the wood. Behind her, inside the barn, Eli made no sound. She hoped he had sense enough to keep it that way. Voss looked past her toward the barn. "You seen anyone?" "No." The lie came out clean. She was almost surprised by how easy it felt. Voss watched her face, and Margaret understood that he had not ridden out because he knew Eli was here. He had ridden out because he suspected it. There was a difference, and on the frontier, a difference like that could keep a person alive. The younger man said, "Horse tracks come right through her gate." Voss lifted one hand, silencing him without looking away from Margaret. "Lots of horses come through my gate," she said. "Most of them belong here." "A stranger's horse." "I did not see a stranger." Voss smiled again, but there was no warmth in it. "You are a brave woman, Mrs. Wren." "I have had to be." "That can become expensive." The wind pushed loose snow across the yard between them. The lantern in the barn shifted behind her, and for one terrible moment Margaret feared the light might show movement through the cracks. She did not turn. She did not blink. Voss let the silence stretch. Then he said, "A widow alone should be careful who she shelters. A rancher with no welcome should be careful where he trespasses." The younger rider's head snapped toward her. His hand moved near his coat. Margaret raised the rifle just enough to be understood. Voss chuckled low and calm. "No need for hard feelings. We were only asking after a wounded man." "Then ask in town tomorrow. And if he dies before morning." Then he will answer to God before he answers to you. For the first time, Voss's smile faded. There it was, Margaret thought, the small crack in his polished face. She had seen it only twice before. Once when she refused his first offer for Red Lantern Ranch. Again when she refused the second offer, the one wrapped in false sympathy and bank figures he should not have known. Voss leaned back in the saddle. Your husband understood when a fight was too large for one family. Margaret felt the words strike low and deep. My husband died facing trouble, she said, not hiding behind it. The younger rider looked away. Even he knew Voss had gone too far. For a long moment, the only sounds were wind, horses, and the faint creak of the gate chain. Then Voss gathered his reins. Morning comes quick, Mrs. Wren. Things look different by daylight. They usually look clearer. Yes, he said softly, they do. He turned his horse. The younger man followed, though not before casting one last look toward the barn. They rode north along the road, their shapes growing smaller against the pale snow until the dark took them. Margaret stayed where she was, until she could no longer hear the hooves. Only then did she go back inside. Eli had pushed himself upright against the stall wall. His face had lost more color, and one hand was pressed tight to his bandaged shoulder. But his eyes were alert, troubled, and fixed on her as if he had heard every word. You lied for me, he said. I lied because I do not like Silas Voss asking questions on my land. That is not the same thing. It is close enough for tonight. He looked toward the barn door. You should not have done that. Margaret set the rifle down harder than she meant to. I am getting tired of men telling me what I should not do. His mouth closed. She took the water dipper and held it out. His hand shook when he reached for it, so she stepped closer and steadied the cup without speaking. He drank slowly, with the controlled carefulness of a man trying not to show how badly he needed help. The gesture stirred something in her she did not welcome. Not trust. Not softness. Recognition. She knew what it looked like when pride was the last blanket a person had left. Why would Voss be looking for you? She asked. Eli wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. I do not know that he was. He asked after a wounded man, less than an hour after one fell at my gate. That could be chance. Do not insult me, Mr. Ransom. The name sat strangely between them now. He looked down. I may have crossed land that belonged to him. That does not earn a bullet. Some men think any crossing earns one. Margaret studied him. The lines of his face were drawn with pain, but there was something guarded beneath it. He was measuring every word before he gave it to her, not like a simple drifter hiding a card game gone bad, like a man used to secrets having weight. Are you an outlaw? She asked. No. Wanted. Not by any sheriff worth naming. That is a careful answer. I have lived long enough to favor careful answers. And I have buried a husband, fought a neighbor, lost hired hands, watched my cattle scatter through cut wire, and read bank letters written by men who never set foot on my land but somehow know exactly how to frighten me. Margaret stepped closer, anger rising with each word. So I favor plain ones. Eli looked at her then, really looked. The lantern light showed his eyes more clearly now. Gray, tired, and older than the rest of his face. She saw guilt there. Not the cheap guilt of a liar caught in a story, but the deeper kind carried by men who had failed someone they loved and never forgiven themselves for living afterward. I am not here to steal from you, he said quietly. I am not here to hurt you. I did not know this was your ranch when my horse brought me through that gate. If I had known a widow was alone here, I would have tried to fall somewhere else. The strange honesty of that answer took some of the fire from her. Why? Because trouble follows me. Trouble already lives here. His eyes moved to hers. For a moment the barn seemed smaller. The wind outside softened and the cattle settled. Between them sat the truth neither of them had named. Margaret was not only sheltering a wounded stranger, he was not only being sheltered by a lonely widow. Two separate storms had met under the same roof, and neither one knew yet which storm would break first. She turned away before the silence could become too human. "You will sleep here tonight," she said. "At first light I will check the wound. If fever sets in, I will send for Dr. Harlan." "No doctor." "If you need one, I will send." "No," his voice sharpened then weakened. "Please." Margaret paused. There it was again. Fear. Not of pain, not of death, of being named, seen, found. She lowered her voice. "Who are you really?" Eli closed his eyes. For a second she thought he would finally answer. Instead, he leaned his head back against the stall wall, sweat shining at his temples. "A man who should have kept riding," he said. Margaret stood with the lantern in her hand, watching him fight to stay conscious. She wanted to demand the truth. She wanted to send him away. She wanted, more than anything, to understand why the sight of him bleeding in her barn made her feel as if the whole future of Red Lantern Ranch had shifted in one night. But before she could speak, Eli opened his eyes again. "Mrs. Wren," he whispered, "if Voss comes back with more men, do not protect me." Margaret held his gaze. Outside, far off in the dark, a single gunshot cracked across the northern ridge. The horses in the barn startled hard against their stalls. Margaret turned toward the sound. Eli's face changed in an instant. Not fear now. Recognition. And that frightened her more than anything he had said. The gunshot rolled over the ridge and vanished into the cold dark. For a few seconds afterward, no one moved. The horses stamped and pulled at their ropes. One cow bawled from the far end of the barn, deep and uneasy. The lantern in Margaret's hand trembled enough to make the shadows jump along the stall walls. Eli Ransom looked toward the north, as if the sound had spoken his name. Margaret saw it clearly. The wound had weakened him. Blood loss had dulled his face. Fever had begun to shine in his eyes, but that shot cut through all of it. It woke something trained and watchful inside him. "You know what that was," she said. "A warning. From Voss." Eli did not answer quickly enough. Margaret set the lantern on an overturned feed bucket and picked up the rifle again. "Mr. Ransom, I have given you my barn, my bandages, my water, and a lie told to a man who already means me harm. You will not repay that by holding back every truth until it gets me killed." He flinched at the word killed, though not from fear for himself. "I do not know if it was Voss," he said, "but I know that was not a hunter, too late, too close to a house. One shot only. Men fire one shot at night when they want someone to hear it. And you think that someone is you." "I think it may be." Margaret looked toward the barn door. The north ridge sat beyond the cottonwoods, beyond the frozen wash, along the line where Voss land began pushing its greedy shoulder against hers. It was too dark to see any rider now, but the darkness itself seemed to be listening. She turned back to Eli. "Then give me one reason I should not put you on your horse and send you toward it." He tried to hold her gaze. Pain made his eyes narrow. "Because you are not that kind of woman. You do not know what kind of woman I am." "No," he said softly, "but I know what kind you are not." The words landed in the barn with unexpected weight. Margaret hated that they touched her. For 18 months, Silas Voss and men like him had spoken of her as if widowhood had changed her into something less than a whole person, less capable, less steady, less worthy of land, respect, and privacy. Yet this stranger, bleeding in her straw, had known her for 1 hour and already saw one truth clearly. She would point a rifle at danger. She would lie to a snake. She would fight until her hands split and her voice failed. But she would not send a wounded man into the dark to die. That was her strength, and maybe her danger. "You will stay quiet," she said. "You will not move unless I tell you. If you faint, try to do it silently." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret took the lantern, blew it out, and let the barn fall into moonlit shadow. Then she waited. Nothing came. No riders, no second shot, no voice calling from the road, only wind slipping through the boards and the long breathing of animals. The waiting stretched until her arms ached from holding the rifle, until the cold crept under her shawl and settled against her skin. At last Eli spoke from the dark. "He wants you tired." "Who?" "Any man using fear instead of force. He does not need to break your gate if he can make you stand beside it all night." Margaret turned her head slightly. "You speak like you have studied such men." "I have met a few." "That is another careful answer." "It is the truest one I can give tonight." She let silence answer him. Near dawn, Eli's fever rose. By the time the eastern sky paled over the windmill, his skin had gone hot beneath her palm, and his speech began to slip between waking and memory. He muttered names she did not know: a man called Henry, a place called Rockford, a promise broken near a depot. Once he gripped Margaret's wrist and whispered, "Do not sign it. The deed is false." She froze. What deed? But he was gone again, lost beneath fever. Margaret stood over him, heart beating hard. "The deed is false." Those were not the wandering words of a gambler, not the fear of a hired gun. That was the language of paper, land, fraud, and courts. It sounded too close to the nightmare already sitting on her own kitchen table in the form of bank notices and survey letters. At sunrise, she made her choice. She would not send for Dr. Harlan in town. Eli had begged her not to, and after the night's warning shot, she understood that bringing any man from town might carry news faster than medicine. So she rode to the old Miller place instead, 2 miles south, where Mrs. Adeline Pike lived with her widowed sister and knew more about wounds, fever, childbirth, and stubborn men than any doctor Margaret had ever met. Adeline came at once, wrapped in a gray wool cloak, her medical bag knocking against the saddle. She was near 60, sharp-eyed and plain-spoken. When she saw Eli in the barn, she glanced once at Margaret, once at the wound, and asked no foolish questions. "Bullet passed through?" "Yes." "Clean cloth?" "As clean as I had." "Whiskey?" "Used." "Good. He may live then if he stops trying not to." Adeline worked with brisk hands. Eli woke only once, looked at her face, then at Margaret's and tried to sit up. Adeline pushed him down with 2 fingers. "Young man, I have put stronger fools than you back in bed." "I am not young," he muttered. "Then you ought to know better." Margaret almost smiled. She had not smiled in a barn since before Daniel died, and the unfamiliar movement hurt in a strange way. When Adeline finished, she stepped outside with Margaret near the water trough. The morning had turned clear and bitter. Sunlight laid itself over the snow, beautiful enough to make the hard world look innocent. Adeline tied her bag shut. "He is no common drifter." Margaret looked at her. "You saw that in his shoulder." "I saw it in his hands. No rope burns fresh. No saddle calluses deep enough for a man who claims the trail as a living. But old ink marks near the fingers. A healed cut along the thumb from paper, not cattle wire. And when fever took him, he kept reaching toward his coat pocket like something written there mattered more than his wound." Margaret had not checked his coat. She should have. The thought shamed her, then hardened into caution. Adeline watched her carefully. "Silas Voss rode past my place before sunrise." Margaret's stomach tightened. "Toward town?" "No, toward the old survey road." The old survey road ran along the back edge of Red Lantern Ranch, where Daniel had once argued the county maps were wrong by nearly 80 yards. He had meant to challenge it before his death. After the funeral, Margaret had not had the money, time, or strength to keep fighting every line drawn by men who never touched the soil. "What would he want there?" Margaret asked. Adeline's mouth pressed thin. "The same thing he always wants, more than belongs to him." Before leaving, Adeline touched Margaret's arm, rough but kind. "Be careful whom you trust, but be more careful of standing alone so long you forget help when it comes limping." Margaret watched her ride away. Help. The word felt dangerous. Inside the barn, Eli slept under 2 blankets, breathing unevenly but alive. Margaret stood beside him for a long moment, then looked toward his coat hanging over the stall rail. She told herself a decent woman did not search an injured man's pockets. Then she remembered Voss at her gate, the warning shot, the fevered words. "Do not sign it, the deed is false." Margaret reached into the coat. Her fingers found a small leather packet tucked deep inside the inner lining. It was worn from travel and tied with a thin strip of black cord. She opened it slowly. Inside were 3 things. A folded newspaper clipping from St. Louis about a railroad land fraud trial. A small brass badge with the words Territorial Claims Office stamped across it. And a letter addressed to a man named Nathaniel Cross. Not Eli Ransom. Nathaniel Cross. Margaret stared at the name until the barn blurred around it. The stranger had lied about who he was. Not a small lie, not a frightened man's half-truth. A whole name, a whole life. Behind her, Eli stirred. "Mrs. Wren," he said hoarsely. She turned with the badge in her hand. His face changed when he saw it. Weariness first, then regret, then the quiet look of a man whose last wall had been pulled down before he was ready. Margaret's voice came out low. "Who is Nathaniel Cross?" Eli closed his eyes. Outside, a rider's bell jingled faintly on the road from town. Someone was coming again. And this time, Margaret was holding proof that the wounded stranger in her barn was not a drifter at all. The rider's bell came closer. It was a small sound, bright and harmless on any other morning. A harness bell, the kind some town drivers tied near the collar so folks could hear a wagon coming around blind turns. But after a night of gunshots, lies, and Silas Voss at her gate, even that cheerful little ring made Margaret's fingers close harder around the brass badge in her hand. Eli or Nathaniel Cross watched her from the straw. The false name sat between them like a loaded rifle. "Put those away," he said. Margaret did not move. "You are in no position to give orders." "Mrs. Wren, please." The word please did more than his warning. It was rough with fear, and not the kind of fear a guilty man had for being exposed. It sounded like fear for her. That made her angrier. "You told me your name was Eli Ransom." It was safer. For whom? His eyes held hers. Fever still shone in his face, but his mind had cleared enough to understand the damage. "For anyone standing near me." The bell grew louder. A wagon now, not a rider. Wheels creaked over frozen ruts outside the yard. Margaret folded the newspaper clipping, badge, and let her back into the packet, then slipped it into her apron pocket instead of returning it to his coat. Nathaniel noticed. "You should not keep that. You should have told me what it was. I was bleeding at the time. And afterward." His jaw tightened. "Afterward, I hoped to be gone before it mattered." The words should have relieved her. They did not. She hated that a small part of her had already begun to measure the barn differently with him in it. Hated that his quiet voice had made the long night feel less empty. Hated that finding a lie hurt more than it should have when she had known from the beginning he was hiding something. She stepped toward the barn door. "Stay silent." "Margaret." It was the first time he had used her given name. She stopped but did not turn. Whoever is outside, do not show them that packet. I know how to keep trouble out of my own yard. I believe you do. His voice softened. But this kind of trouble has keys to doors you cannot see. That line followed her into the morning. The wagon waiting near the yard belonged to Mr. Amos Bell, the clerk from the land office in Briar Gulch. He was a thin, nervous man with narrow shoulders and a hat too large for his head. Margaret had never known him to call anywhere uninvited. He spent most of his life behind a desk, licking stamps and pretending ink made him important. Today, he stood beside his wagon, rubbing his gloved hands together, eyes moving from the house to the barn and back again. "Mrs. Wren," he called, "fine morning considering the cold. If you came to discuss weather, Mr. Bell, you picked a poor hour." His smile failed. "Yes, ma'am, I do apologize. I have brought notice from the county office, official notice." Margaret walked close enough to take the paper, but not close enough for him to see past her shoulder into the barn. His wagon horse shifted, tossing its head. The bell at its harness gave one last small ring and stilled. Amos held out an envelope. She knew before she opened it that it would be bad. Good news did not arrive before breakfast in a clerk's shaking hands. The notice was written in stiff black ink. It said a boundary review had been requested concerning the northern section of Red Lantern Ranch. It said the old survey from Daniel's filing was under dispute. It said until the matter was settled, any water rights along the upper wash could be considered shared access. Shared. Margaret read the word twice. Shared meant Silas Voss could push cattle into the wash and call it lawful. Shared meant he could muddy the spring, cut the bank, and claim he had rights while the county took months to decide what Daniel's own marked stones had already settled years ago. Who requested this? She asked, though she knew. Amos looked at the ground. Mr. Voss brought supporting documents. Supporting lies, you mean? I cannot speak to that. Number men in offices rarely can. He swallowed. There will be a hearing in 3 weeks. 3 weeks, Margaret's voice sharpened. My cattle need that water today. The notice only says what it says. And you rode through snow to hand it to me personally. Amos shifted, miserable. Mr. Voss thought it best you receive it without delay. There it was, Voss's hand behind the county seal, his smile hiding under official words. He could not force her out with one blow, so he would make the land harder to live on one paper at a time. Margaret folded the notice carefully. Too carefully. If she let her hands shake, Amos would see it, and by noon half of Briar Gulch would know she was frightened. "Tell the county office I received it," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "And tell Mr. Voss nothing." Amos's eyes widened. "I did not say I was going to see him." "You did not need to." The poor man flushed, climbed back into his wagon, and turned toward the road with more haste than grace. Margaret waited until he was gone before she let herself breathe. 3 weeks. Daniel had known the old survey was wrong. He had marked the true boundary with stone, cedar posts, and a hand-drawn map kept somewhere among his papers. After his death, Margaret had searched for it once, then stopped when grief turned every drawer into a wound. She had told herself she would look again when the ranch was steadier. The ranch had never become steadier. Inside the barn, Nathaniel was trying to stand. She found him with one hand braced against the stall rail, face white, shirt dark at the edge of the bandage. "Sit down before you open that wound." "I heard enough." "I imagine you did." "Boundary review." She held up the notice. "Your ears work well for a half-dead man." He lowered himself slowly onto the straw, breathing hard. "Voss is moving faster than I expected." Margaret stared at him. "Than you expected." Nathaniel closed his eyes for a moment, as if he had cursed himself silently. Men like him do not start with gunfire if paper can do the work cleaner. You know men like him. Yes. Because of that badge. He looked at her apron pocket. That badge is old. But real. Yes. What is the Territorial Claims Office? For a moment, he said nothing. Sunlight slipped through the cracks in the barn wall, striping his face with pale gold and shadow. He looked less like a drifter now, and more like a man standing in front of a door he had kept locked for too long. It was part of my work, he said finally. Land claims, fraud, false deeds, bank pressure, survey tampering. Each word struck too close. Margaret felt the cold barn floor beneath her boots. You investigate men like Silas Voss. I used to. Why stop? His gaze dropped. There was the wall again. But now she had seen the hinges. Who is Henry? She asked. Nathaniel's face changed. It was so quick another woman might have missed it. Margaret did not. The name struck him deeper than the bullet. You spoke it in fever, she said. Henry Rockford, a false deed. His fingers curled into the blanket. Henry Vale was my partner. Was. He is dead. The barn went quiet. Margaret's anger cooled, not gone but changed. She knew the shape of that word. Dead. How it entered a room and took a chair no one else could sit in. How it made every sentence after it softer without meaning to. Nathaniel stared past her toward the open stall door. We were investigating a ring that stole ranches without firing a shot. They used false surveys, frightened clerks, banknotes called due at the worst time, men paid to swear lies. By the time a family realized what was happening, they had already signed away half their future. Margaret's hand drifted toward the notice. Nathaniel saw. Yes, he said quietly. That is why I know what Voss is doing. Is he part of that ring? I do not know. But you think he may be. I think he learned from someone who was. The wind pushed at the barn walls. A fine line of snow blew under the door and melted near Margaret's boot. She pulled the leather packet from her pocket and held it up. Why were you carrying this through my land? I was not aiming for your land. Then where? He hesitated. This time Margaret did not speak. She simply waited. At last Nathaniel said, Briar Gulch, the land office. I had reason to believe someone there had been filing altered claims under old names. I came to look through the records quietly. Under a false name. For my safety. And mine. His silence answered. Margaret looked away, toward the far wall where Daniel's old saddle hung on a peg. Dust lay thick over the seat. She had not touched it since the funeral. Seeing it now made something rise in her throat. Daniel had fought honest. That was why he had died without proof in his hand. Margaret could not afford to fight honest in the same simple way. Not anymore. She looked back at Nathaniel Cross. Can you prove Voss is behind this boundary review? Maybe. Can you prove the survey is false? If the original markers are still where your husband left them, if you have Daniel's papers, if the land office has not been fully cleaned, and if you help me. His eyes lifted. The question trembled between them, bigger than the barn. Nathaniel's voice was low. If I help you, I may bring the men who killed Henry Vale straight to this ranch. Margaret absorbed that, feeling its weight settle beside all the other weights she already carried. Then she folded the county notice and put it beside his leather packet. Mr. Cross, she said, no longer using the name he had given her, those men may already be here. They just wear better coats. For the first time, he had no careful answer. A gust of wind shook the barn door. Outside, far beyond the yard, a crow lifted from the north fence line and cried once over the snow. Margaret turned toward the house. "I am going to find my husband's old survey map," she said. "And when I do, you are going to tell me whether Silas Voss is stealing my land with ink." Nathaniel watched her go, pale and silent. But just before she reached the door, he spoke. "Mrs. Wren." She turned. If Daniel marked the true line himself, Voss will know that map exists. Margaret's heart tightened. Nathaniel's eyes moved toward the ranch house. "And if he knows, he may already have sent someone to find it before you do." Margaret did not walk to the ranch house. She ran. The cold air cut into her lungs as she crossed the yard, boots striking hard against the frozen ground. The county notice crackled in her fist. Behind her, the barn door moved in the wind with a long wooden groan, but she did not look back. Nathaniel's warning followed her faster than any rider. If Voss knew Daniel's old survey map existed, he may already have sent someone to find it. The thought struck every room before she entered it. Her kitchen looked the same as it had an hour earlier. Coffee pot on the stove, blue cup beside the sink, a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth on the table, Daniel's old chair pushed in neatly, though no one had sat there for 18 months. The house held no sign of violence, no broken lock, no muddy boot print near the door. That should have comforted her. It did not. Men like Silas Voss did not always break a door when they wanted something. Sometimes they smiled their way in. Sometimes they paid a weak man to search while a widow was in the barn tending a wounded stranger. Sometimes they waited until grief itself had hidden the thing they needed. Margaret went first to the desk in the sitting room. It had been Daniel's desk, though calling it that made it sound grander than it was. A square oak piece with one uneven leg, 2 drawers that stuck in winter, and ink stains along the top where Daniel had written cattle numbers, feed accounts, and letters to merchants in Cheyenne. Margaret had avoided those drawers as much as possible since the funeral. Not because she feared finding something shameful, but because she feared finding something ordinary. A dull pencil. A receipt for nails. A list in Daniel's hand. Sometimes plain things hurt worse than graves. She pulled the top drawer open. Papers shifted inside. Old bills, a church notice, a folded letter from Daniel's sister in Missouri. Margaret searched fast, then slower, then fast again, as if changing the speed might change what appeared beneath her hands. No map. The second drawer stuck. She jerked it hard enough that the whole desk scraped against the floor. Inside were land tax papers, a rusted pocket knife, string, a small tin of buttons, and Daniel's leather-bound account book. Her fingers stopped on that book. For a moment the room blurred. Daniel had carried it everywhere. He wrote in it at night by lamplight, lips moving slightly when numbers refused to settle. Margaret used to tease him that he looked sterner over cattle feed than most judges looked over murder. He would glance up and say, "A ranch is won or lost by little numbers, Maggie. Big trouble only gets the credit." She had not heard anyone call her Maggie since he died. She opened the account book. The first pages were normal: purchases, cattle counts, rail fees. Then, halfway through, between a note about fence wire and a list of hired hands, she found a line that made her breath catch. North line wrong by near 80 yards. Stone marker under split cottonwood. Map in Bible box till I can file. Bible box. Margaret turned so quickly her skirt caught against the desk corner. The Bible box sat in the bedroom under the washstand. Daniel had made it their first winter at Red Lantern Ranch to keep the family Bible safe from damp. She had not opened it in months, maybe a year. After Daniel's death, Scripture had become difficult. She still believed, but belief had not made the bed less empty or the bills less cruel. She crossed into the bedroom and knelt. The washstand curtain brushed against her cheek as she pulled out the cedar box. Dust marked her fingertips. The brass latch was stiff, and for one terrible second, She imagined opening it to find nothing but a clean, empty bottom. The latch gave. Inside lay the Bible, wrapped in cloth. Beneath it were pressed flowers, a ribbon from their wedding, 2 letters Daniel had written while buying cattle down south, and a small folded oilcloth packet. Margaret's hands shook as she lifted it out. She opened the packet on the bed. There it was. Daniel's map. Not fancy, not official, drawn in his steady hand with dark ink and small careful marks. The creek bend, the old wagon road, the split cottonwood, the stone marker, the upper wash. The northern line drawn not where the county's copied survey placed it, but where Daniel had always said the true claim ran. And beside the map was a second page. A signed statement. Margaret read the first line, and the room went so quiet that even the wind seemed to wait. I, Daniel Wren, write this in case anything happens to me before the corrected survey can be filed. Her hand went to her mouth. Anything happens to me. Daniel had known. Maybe not everything, maybe not the exact hand that would strike, but he had known his fight over the north boundary was becoming dangerous. He had known the land was worth more than grass. He had known someone was circling Red Lantern Ranch before Margaret ever saw the wolf's eyes in Sila's vase. She forced herself to read on. Daniel wrote that he had found evidence the county copy of their northern line had been changed after filing. He wrote that the original corner marker still stood near the split cottonwood, though someone had tried to cover it with brush. He wrote that Amos Bell at the land office had once admitted, after too much whiskey, that Sila's vase had been pressing him to correct old mistakes in the records. He wrote that if he could not file the corrected map himself, Margaret was to bring it to Judge Emmett Rawlins in Briar Gulch, and no one else. No one else. Margaret thought of Amos Bell's pale face that morning, his shaking hands, the way he would not meet her eyes. Her grief shifted. It did not leave. Grief never left just because anger entered the room, but it stood up straighter inside her. Daniel had not died, leaving her helpless. He had left her a trail. A noise sounded behind her. Not outside. Inside the house. A floorboard creaked near the kitchen. Margaret froze. She had left the kitchen door unlatched. Her eyes moved to the rifle. It was not with her. She had left it in the barn. The bedroom felt suddenly too small. The map lay open on the bed, plain as sunlight. She folded it with trembling speed and shoved both papers into the front of her dress, beneath the shawl. Another creak. Then the sound of a drawer being opened in the sitting room. Someone was inside her house. Margaret looked around for anything she could use. Her hand closed around the heavy iron poker beside the small bedroom stove. She lifted it slowly, holding her breath. The sitting room drawer shut. A man muttered under his breath. Not Voss. Younger. The footsteps came closer. Margaret stepped behind the bedroom door, heart hammering so hard she feared the sound might betray her. The iron poker felt clumsy in her grip. Her palms were damp. She thought of Daniel, of his careful map, of 18 months spent believing she had been fighting alone, when all along his last warning had been waiting beneath the Bible. The bedroom door pushed inward. A man entered halfway, his back to her. It was Roy Ketter, one of Voss's hands. She recognized the narrow shoulders, the red scarf, the pale hair sticking under his hat. He held one of Daniel's account books in his hand and was looking toward the washstand. Margaret raised the poker. Before she could strike, Roy turned. His eyes widened. Mrs. Wren. What are you doing in my house? He stepped back. Door was open, I called out. You did not. I came with a message. With my husband's book in your hand. Roy looked down as if surprised to find it there. I thought it was mine. Margaret almost laughed. the sound bitter and sharp in her chest. "You thought my dead husband's account book was yours." His face hardened. Fear left him, replaced by the uglier courage men borrowed from stronger men. "Mr. Voss says you are to stay clear of the North Wash until the hearing. Mr. Voss does not give orders in my bedroom." Roy's eyes flicked toward the washstand, too quick, too hungry. He had been sent for the map. Margaret knew it with cold certainty. She stepped into the doorway, blocking his view of the bed. The papers pressed against her chest beneath her dress. She could feel the edges like a second heartbeat. "Leave," she said. Roy's mouth twisted. "You should take the offer while he is still polite. A woman alone cannot hold land just because she cries over a grave." The poker rose in her hand before she had time to think. Roy saw the movement and stepped back. Then another voice spoke from behind him. "She is not alone." Nathaniel Cross stood in the hall, one hand braced against the wall, his face white as flour and his shirt stained fresh at the shoulder. In his other hand he held Margaret's rifle. He looked like a man who might fall before taking 3 steps. But his eyes were steady. Roy turned on him, startled. "Who are you?" Nathaniel lifted the rifle just enough. "The man asking you to walk out before this becomes more serious than trespassing." Roy stared at him, measuring the wound, the weakness, the gun. For one dangerous second, Margaret thought he might try him. Then Nathaniel spoke again, quieter. "And Roy, when Silas asks whether you found Daniel Wren's map, you tell him this. Tell him he should have feared what a dead man left behind more than what a widow might remember." Roy's face drained. That name, that map. Nathaniel had guessed enough and aimed the words perfectly. Roy backed into the hall, then toward the kitchen. Margaret followed with the poker raised until he stumbled out the door and ran for his horse. Only when the sound of hooves faded did Nathaniel lower the rifle. Then his knees buckled. Margaret dropped the poker and caught him before he hit the floor. His weight nearly took her down with him, but she held on, one arm around his back, one hand pressed to the bleeding bandage. "You fool," she whispered. "You opened the wound." He gave a weak breath, almost a laugh. "Seemed rude to let you defend the house alone." She wanted to scold him. She wanted to thank him. She wanted not to feel the sudden fear that clutched at her when his head sagged against her shoulder. Instead, she lowered him carefully into Daniel's old chair. For a moment, neither spoke. The house still smelled of cold air, dust, and danger. Margaret pulled the map from beneath her shawl and laid it on the table between them. Nathaniel's eyes moved over it, sharpening despite his pain. "This is enough to start," he said. "To win." "No," he looked up at her, "to make Voss desperate." Outside, the wind swept Roy Ketter's tracks toward the north road. Margaret looked at the map Daniel had hidden for her, and then at the wounded stranger who had lied about his name, but stood between her and danger anyway. For the first time since Daniel's death, she felt something other than survival stirring in the house. Not peace. Not safety. A beginning. If you believe one hidden truth can change the fate of a whole ranch, stay with this story, because Daniel Wren's map was only the first secret buried at Red Lantern Ranch. Nathaniel touched one finger to the corner of the paper. "Margaret," he said, voice low, "there is something wrong with this map." Her hope faltered. "What do you mean?" He looked toward the north window, where Voss Ridge waited beyond the snow. Daniel marked more than a boundary. He marked a place someone wanted forgotten. Nathaniel's words made the kitchen feel colder than the winter morning outside. Margaret stood on one side of the table, one hand still pressed against the folded shawl at her waist, the other resting near Daniel's old account book. Across from her, Nathaniel sat in Daniel's chair, pale and unsteady, with blood showing through the fresh cloth at his shoulder. Between them lay the map. Daniel's map. For a moment, Margaret could not make herself look at it. She looked instead at the small marks time had left on the table. A knife scratch from their first Christmas on the ranch. A dark ring where Daniel had once set down a hot coffee pot and laughed when she scolded him. A dent near the edge from the day he had dropped his hammer while building the porch steps. This house remembered him in 100 quiet ways. Now Nathaniel was telling her that Daniel had left behind more than a boundary line. "What place?" she asked. Nathaniel leaned closer to the map, his finger hovering over the upper wash. "Here." Margaret followed the point. At first she saw only Daniel's ordinary markings: Creek Bend, Split Cottonwood, Stone Marker, North Fence. Then she noticed what Nathaniel had noticed: 3 tiny dots arranged near a small rise above the wash, not labeled like the rest. Daniel had drawn them lightly, almost as if he had not wanted the marks to be seen unless someone knew to look. "I thought those were rocks," she said. "Maybe, but your husband labeled every stone marker clearly. These he left unnamed." "Daniel marked things plain." "Exactly." Nathaniel's breathing caught. He pressed his hand against his shoulder and waited for the pain to pass. Margaret moved as if to help, but he shook his head once. "Stubborn man." She poured him water anyway and set it near his hand. He looked at it, then at her. "Thank you." She did not answer. Gratitude felt too soft for the hour. "What do you think it is?" she asked. "I do not know yet. But men do not risk sending a hand into a widow's bedroom for a boundary map unless the map threatens more than a line in the dirt." Margaret looked toward the window. Beyond the frosted glass, the yard sat white and still. Roy Ketter's tracks had already begun to blur under blowing snow. Soon there would be little proof he had come at all. That was how Voss worked. Every wrong thing vanished before she could lay it in front of a judge. But not this time. This time she had Daniel's map. "Can you ride?" she asked. Nathaniel looked up sharply. "No." "You answered too fast." "Because the truth was easy." "Can you sit a horse if I help you mount?" His eyes narrowed. "That is not the same question." "It is the question I am asking." "No." Margaret folded the map with care and slid it back into the oilcloth. "Then I will go alone." Nathaniel pushed himself straighter and the effort cost him. "Absolutely not. You do not get to tell me what to do on my own land. I get to tell you when you are about to walk into a trap. I have walked into traps for 18 months. The difference is, now I know where one may be. That does not make it safer." "No," she said, "it makes it useful." For a long moment, they stared at one another across the table. Nathaniel was the first to look away. His mouth tightened, but Margaret could see the calculation behind his eyes. He knew she was right, and he hated it. He also knew that if he pressed too hard, she would leave without him. She had the look of a woman who had taken all the warning she could bear and was ready for motion. At last he said, "If you go, you do not go by the main trail. I know this ranch better than any man alive." "I believe that, but Voss knows where he would set watchers. Use the creek bed until the bend. Keep below the bank. Do not cross open ground near the old wagon road." Margaret studied him. "You have not even seen that part of the ranch." "I saw enough riding in." "You were half dead." Half-dead men still notice where bullets might come from. The answer should have chilled her. Instead, it steadied her in an odd way. Nathaniel Cross had lied about his name, but he did not lie about danger. He saw it clearly, maybe clearer than she did. She gathered her coat, gloves, and Daniel's old field glass from the peg near the door. When she reached for the rifle, Nathaniel spoke again. "Take the smaller carbine from the pantry." Margaret turned. "How do you know there is a carbine in the pantry?" "I saw the oil mark on the shelf when Roy backed through the kitchen." Despite everything, Margaret almost smiled. You notice too much. It has kept me alive. Has it kept you happy? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Nathaniel's face changed, not sharply, but enough that she regretted it at once. His hand rested near the edge of Daniel's map. His thumb moved over the oilcloth tie without opening it. No, he said quietly, it has not. Something in his honesty reached across the room. Margaret looked away first. I will be back before noon. If you are not, then you will not be strong enough to come after me. That was not comfort. It was not meant to be. She left him sitting there with the rifle near his knee and pain in his face, and for reasons she refused to name, the house felt less empty with him in it. Outside, the cold hit hard. Margaret saddled Juniper behind the barn where the wind had carved the snow into long white ribs. She did not take the road. She turned south first, circling low behind the cattle pens, then cut west toward the frozen creek bed. The horse moved carefully, breath steaming, ears flicking at every sound. The land looked peaceful under snow. That was the cruel thing about it. A ranch could look calm while men fought over it. A grave could look still while a widow's heart kept breaking beside it. A fence could stand straight while the papers in town quietly moved it 80 yards north. Margaret rode with Daniel's map tucked inside her coat, pressed against her ribs. It felt warm there despite the cold. Every few minutes she touched it through the wool, as if making sure it still existed. At the creek bend, she dismounted and led Juniper beneath the bank. Ice cracked softly underfoot. Cottonwood branches scratched the pale sky above her. She moved slower now, careful not to leave tracks where they would show too plainly from the ridge. The split cottonwood stood exactly where Daniel had drawn it. Age had hollowed one side of the trunk. The split ran down the middle like a wound that had healed around its own pain. Beneath it, partly hidden by brush and drifted snow, stood the old stone marker. Margaret knelt and brushed it clear with her gloves. There were initials carved into the top. D.W. Daniel Wren. Her breath caught. For 18 months, men had spoken of Daniel as if death had made him silent. But here he was, speaking in stone, ink, and patience. He had left proof under trees, in books, beneath the Bible, waiting for the day grief loosened its grip enough for her to find it. I found it, she whispered. The wind carried the words nowhere. She took out the field glass and looked toward the 3 dots marked on the map. The rise above the wash sat bare except for sagebrush and a scatter of stones. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then she saw a corner of dark wood showing beneath snow near a shallow cut in the earth. Not a rock. A buried box. Margaret's heartbeat changed. She tied Juniper in the creek bed and climbed the rise on foot, keeping low. Snow soaked the hem of her dress. The wind pulled at her bonnet. She reached the cut in the earth and dropped to her knees. The box was small, no bigger than a bread drawer and half covered by frozen dirt. It had been buried once, then disturbed recently. The soil around it was broken in a way fresh weather could not explain. Someone had already tried to dig it up. Her fingers shook as she cleared the lid. The latch was rusted but not locked. Margaret lifted it. Inside lay a canvas pouch, a broken survey chain, and 3 folded papers wrapped in wax cloth. She opened the first paper. Names. Dates. Payments. Her eyes moved down the page until one name made the cold vanish from her skin. Silas Voss. Beside his name was another. Amos Bell. And beneath them, in Daniel's handwriting, one line had been written harder than the rest. If I am killed before filing, this proves the boundary theft was planned. Margaret's throat tightened until she could not breathe. Killed. Not hurt, not delayed, not cheated. Killed. Daniel had not writ as a worried rancher protecting a claim. He had written as a man who knew someone might stop him before he reached the courthouse. A branch cracked below the rise. Margaret froze. Juniper lifted her head in the creek bed, ears forward. Another crack. Then a man's voice drifted up from below. She came this way. I saw the tracks by the cottonwood. Margaret folded the papers with shaking hands and shoved them into her coat. A second voice answered. Mr. Voss said bring back whatever she finds, her too if she makes noise. Margaret's blood went cold. She looked down the slope and saw two riders moving along the creek bed, rifles resting across their saddles. Roy Ketter was one of them. The other was older, thick-necked, with a gray beard and a dark coat. They had not seen her yet, but they had found Juniper. Margaret backed away from the edge, one hand pressed over the papers beneath her coat. There was nowhere to run that would not show against the snow. No cover except the rocks, the brush, and the shallow cut where Daniel's hidden box lay open at her knees. For one strange, clear moment, she thought of Nathaniel sitting wounded at her kitchen table, warning her not to go alone. Then she thought of Daniel carving his initials into stone, knowing he might never be believed. Margaret closed the box, covered it with loose snow, and crawled toward the far side of the rise. Below her, Roy Ketter called out, Mrs. Wren, no sense hiding, we only want to talk. His voice carried a smile that made the lie worse. Margaret gripped the small carbine and pulled it close, not wanting to use it, praying she would not have to. The older man said, there by the rocks. A shot split the air and struck stone inches from her hand. Margaret dropped flat against the snow. Back at the ranch, Nathaniel Cross sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the clock, one hand against his bleeding shoulder and the other on Daniel's rifle. He had promised himself he would not move unless he had no choice. Then, faint but clear across the frozen land, he heard the gunshot from the wash. And every bit of the man he had tried to bury came alive again. Nathaniel Cross should not have been able to stand. The wound in his shoulder burned like fire under the bandage. Every breath pulled at torn flesh. His knees felt unsteady beneath him, and the kitchen tilted once when he pushed himself out of Daniel Wren's chair. But the gunshot from the wash had done what pain could not prevent. It had given him a direction. For 18 months, Nathaniel had survived by leaving. He had left towns before dawn, left rented rooms with coffee still warm on the stove, left names behind him like dead leaves on a trail. He had told himself it was caution. He had told himself it was wisdom. He had told himself no one else would die because of him if he never stayed close enough to matter. Then Margaret Wren had ridden toward danger with Daniel's map against her heart. And Nathaniel knew, with a bitter clarity that cut deeper than the bullet, that running had never kept him clean. It had only kept him moving. He took Daniel's rifle from the table, checked the chamber with hands that shook, then leaned hard against the wall until the room stopped shifting. His coat hung by the door, stiff with dried blood. He pulled it on and nearly blacked out from the pain. Not yet, he whispered through his teeth. Outside, the yard flashed bright under the winter sun. The snow hurt his eyes. He crossed to the barn with one hand pressed tight to his shoulder, each step leaving a dark spot where the wound had opened again beneath the cloth. Margaret's spare gelding, a dun-colored horse named Amos, stood in the second stall. The animal turned his head and blew softly, as if even he doubted the sense of this. "You and me both," Nathaniel muttered. Saddling took too long. Twice his fingers slipped on the cinch. Once he had to rest his forehead against the horse's warm neck and breathe until the blackness pulled back from the edges of his sight. But he kept seeing Margaret's face the moment she found his badge. Hurt, angry, brave enough to be afraid and keep standing. He had brought secrets to her ranch. Now he would bring whatever truth he still had left. He rode low and slow at first, following the creek path she would have taken. The gelding picked its way through crusted snow, ears flicking toward the north. Nathaniel tried to hold the rifle steady across the saddle, but his right arm was nearly useless, so he guided with his knees and left hand the way he had learned years earlier during a pursuit outside Abilene. The memory came sharp and unwanted. Henry Vale laughing beside him on a dusty Texas road, saying, "You always look like you expect the devil behind every fence post, Nate." Nathaniel had answered, "That is because sometimes he learns to ride." 3 months later, Henry was dead. Nathaniel tightened his jaw and kept riding. At the wash, he found Margaret's tracks where she had tried to hide them. Good work, he thought despite himself. She had used the creek bank, avoided open ground, dismounted at the bend. If she had been born a man, men in town would have called her clever. Because she was a widow, they called her stubborn. A second shot cracked ahead. Nathaniel bent low over the saddle and pushed Amos forward. On the rise above the wash, Margaret lay behind a cluster of stones with the carbine braced in both hands. Snow clung to her shawl. Her bonnet had loosened, and strands of brown hair blew across her face. She had not fired yet. That told Nathaniel two things. She was trapped, and she was still trying not to turn the morning into a killing. Below her, Roy Ketter and the older man had spread apart. Roy held Juniper's reins, keeping Margaret's horse trapped in the creek bed. The older man climbed slowly up the slope, rifle ready but not firing. They wanted her frightened. They wanted the papers. They wanted a widow dragged home with no proof and no witness. Nathaniel lifted Daniel's rifle. His vision blurred. He blinked hard and aimed at the dead branch hanging above Roy's head. He did not need to hit a man. He needed to change the balance. He fired. The branch cracked and dropped into the snow beside Roy's horse. The animal reared. Roy cursed and lost his grip on Juniper's reins. Margaret's mare bolted up the creek bed free. Nathaniel urged Amos down into view. "Step away from her horse," he called. Roy spun toward him, "You again." The older man stopped on the slope, caught between Margaret above and Nathaniel below. Margaret turned her head. For 1 second, anger and relief crossed her face together. Nathaniel would have smiled if he had the strength. Roy raised his rifle, but Nathaniel already had Daniel's gun leveled. "Do not," Nathaniel said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Some warnings carried farther when spoken softly. The older man looked at the blood darkening Nathaniel's coat and grinned. "You look ready to fall over." "I am," Nathaniel said, "but I generally aim before I do." Margaret shifted behind the rocks, carbine now pointed toward the older man. "Both of you ride back to Voss." Roy spat into the snow. "Mr. Voss only wants what belongs to him." "Then he should stop reaching for my coat pocket," Margaret said. The older man's eyes narrowed. "You found something." Margaret did not answer. Nathaniel heard the mistake before the man finished making it. Greedy men often revealed the shape of their orders by asking the wrong question. "Yes," Nathaniel said, "she found enough." Roy's face tightened. "You do not know anything." "I know Silas Voss sent 2 armed men after a widow because he is afraid of Daniel Wren's old papers. I know Amos Bell carried a boundary notice this morning written to look lawful and smell rotten. I know Voss moved before the hearing because he thinks the proof is still buried near the wash." The older man stared at him in surprise. Nathaniel pressed on, watching their eyes. "And now I know the buried proof matters more than the map." Margaret caught the meaning. Her hand moved slightly against her coat, protecting the papers. Roy saw the movement too. He lunged toward Juniper's trail, trying to climb the slope fast. Margaret fired. The shot struck the snow at Roy's feet, spraying ice and dirt. He stumbled backward with a shout, unharmed but shaken. "I said ride back," she called, voice trembling with rage. "Do not make me say it again." For a long second, neither man moved. Then the older one lowered his rifle first. He had enough sense to see the trap had failed. Roy followed, though his face burned with humiliation. They backed toward their horses, mounted, and rode north along the wash, throwing hard looks behind them. Nathaniel kept Daniel's rifle raised until they disappeared beyond the cottonwoods. Then the strength went out of him. He swayed in the saddle. Margaret scrambled down the slope. "Nathaniel." Hearing his true name in her voice did something strange to him. It held him upright one more breath. Then he slid sideways. Margaret reached him before he hit the frozen ground. Not enough to stop the fall completely, but enough to break it. They went down together in the snow, his weight dragging her to one knee. "You stubborn, reckless fool," she said, pressing both hands against his bleeding shoulder. He looked up at her. The sky behind her was white. Her face was full of fear she tried to hide behind anger. "I told you I was not strong enough to come after you," he whispered. "You lied. Only a little." Her mouth trembled, and for one tender, dangerous second, neither of them spoke. Then Margaret pulled the folded papers from inside her coat. Daniel knew. Nathaniel, he wrote that if he was killed, this proved the boundary theft was planned. Nathaniel's face changed. The cold, the pain, the weakness, all of it seemed to fall behind a sharper light in his eyes. "Show me." "Not here. Just the names." She opened the top page enough for him to see. Nathaniel read quickly. Silas Voss, Amos Bell, payment marks, altered survey notes, a date 2 weeks before Daniel's fatal stampede. Then near the bottom, one more name written in a different hand, not Daniel S. Nathaniel stopped breathing. Margaret saw it. "What is it?" He reached toward the page with shaking fingers. "Where did he get this?" "I do not know." "That name," his voice thinned, "the one under Voss." Margaret looked down. "Edwin Pike." "Do you know him?" she asked. Nathaniel closed his eyes. The snow blew around them. Far off, Roy and the older rider vanished beyond Voss Ridge, carrying news of their failure back to the man who had sent them. When Nathaniel opened his eyes again, something old and wounded had risen behind them. "Edwin Pike was tied to the land fraud ring Henry and I investigated," he said. "He was never convicted. We could never prove his hand was in it." Margaret looked at the paper, then back at him. "You think Voss is connected to the same men who killed your partner?" "I do not think it anymore," Nathaniel said. "Daniel's papers prove it." The words settled over the snow like a bell tolling. Margaret had believed she was fighting a greedy neighbor. Nathaniel had believed he was hiding from an old enemy. Now both roads had met at the same buried box. If this moment touched your heart, stay with the story, because sometimes the truth does not come to save people gently. Sometimes it arrives with old names, fresh blood, and a choice no wounded heart is ready to make. Margaret helped Nathaniel onto Amos, then gathered Juniper and led both horses through the creek bed, keeping low until the ranch came into view. The ride back was slow and brutal. Nathaniel nearly slipped twice. Each time, Margaret steadied him with one hand while keeping Daniel's papers tucked close with the other. By the time they reached the barn, Nathaniel's fever had returned. She got him inside the house this time. No more stall, no more distance, no more pretending he was only a stranger passing through. She laid him in the small room off the kitchen where Daniel's winter blankets were stored. Then she cleaned and rebound the wound while he drifted in and out of consciousness. Once he caught her wrist. "Do not take those papers to Amos Bell." "I know." "No, listen. His eyes struggled to focus. If Edwin Pike's name is on that list, Voss is not the top of this. He is only the local hand. Then who do we take it to? Nathaniel swallowed hard. Judge Rollins, Daniel wrote that. Yes. Good, but not yet. We need copies, witnesses, a pattern. Men like Pike do not fear one paper. They fear a story that cannot be pulled apart. Margaret sat beside him, the bloody cloth in her lap, feeling the terrible size of what had opened beneath her life. Daniel's death. Voss's pressure. Nathaniel's false name. Henry Vale's murder. All tied together by ink on a page buried in her own land. She looked at Nathaniel, at the lines of pain around his mouth, at the man who had lied to her and then nearly died coming after her. "Why did you run for 18 months?" she asked softly. His eyes closed. For a while, she thought fever had taken him again. Then he answered, "Because Henry died after I told him he was safe." Margaret's anger quieted. Nathaniel turned his face toward the wall, shame carved into every line of him. "I will not tell you that," he whispered. "I will not tell you any of this is safe." Margaret looked down at Daniel's papers in her hands. "No," she said, "do not tell me it is safe. Tell me how to win." Nathaniel opened his eyes. And this time, for the first time, he did not look like a man trying to disappear from his own life. He looked like the investigator Henry Vale had died believing in. "Then we start," he said, "with the man who delivered the lie to your door." At that very hour, Amos Bell stood in the back room of the Briar Gulch Land Office, staring at the empty shelf where Daniel Wren's corrected filing should have been hidden. Behind him, Silas Voss spoke in a voice colder than the snow outside. "You told me the widow would never find it." Amos trembled. "I thought she would not." Voss stepped closer. "And now?" Amos looked toward the window, where the road to Red Lantern Ranch cut across the white prairie like a scar. "Now," he whispered, "she knows Daniel was murdered." By sundown, Red Lantern Ranch had become quieter than it should have been. Margaret noticed it while carrying firewood from the porch to the kitchen. The cattle had settled too early. The wind had dropped too low. Even the barn cats moved along the wall with their tails tucked close, as if the whole place understood that men were gathering somewhere beyond the ridge and deciding what a widow's courage should cost. Inside the house, Nathaniel slept fitfully in the small room off the kitchen. Not peacefully. Never peacefully. He turned often, whispering broken pieces of old names, old towns, and a warning that came back again and again. "Henry, wait." Each time Margaret heard it, she stopped whatever she was doing. She had known grief as an empty chair, a cold bed, a coat still hanging by the door because taking it down felt too much like burying the man twice. But Nathaniel's grief was different. His had teeth. It followed him through sleep. It rose whenever danger came near someone he cared about, even if he refused to call it caring. Near dusk, Adeline Pike arrived with medicine wrapped in cloth, and a face full of questions she did not ask until Margaret bolted the door behind her. "Roy Ketter rode through town with snow on his coat and fear in his mouth," Adeline said, setting her bag on the table. "By noon, folks were whispering that you fired on Voss men near the wash." "They fired first. I assumed they left that part out." Margaret placed Daniel's papers on the table. Adeline's sharp eyes moved over them. At first, her face held only the stern focus of a woman reading bad news. Then she saw one name and went still. "Edwin Pike." The silence changed. Margaret watched her carefully. "Adeline." The older woman touched the back of a chair, as if the floor had shifted beneath her. "Where did you find this?" "Daniel buried it near the old marker." Adeline sat slowly. The hard lines in her face weakened. showing the tired woman beneath the capable one. "Do you know Edwin Pike?" Margaret asked. Adeline did not answer at once. From the small room, Nathaniel coughed and went quiet again. At last Adeline said, "He was my husband's brother." Margaret stared at her. The name Pike had meant nothing to her except the old widowed neighbor who lived south of the ranch. She had known Adeline for years, trusted her with illness, wounds, and hard truths. She had never once connected her to the name now lying on Daniel's paper like a stain. "My husband, Samuel, was a decent man," Adeline said. "His brother was not. Edwin had charm when he wanted it and a lawyer's tongue without a lawyer's oath. Years ago he made money helping men turn cloudy paperwork into clear ownership. That is how he put it. Cloudy paperwork, as if land did not have families on it, as if a signature could not break a life." Margaret sank into the chair across from her. "Did Daniel know?" "I think he came to suspect." Adeline looked toward the window, where darkness had begun gathering in the corners of the yard. "A month before he died, he rode to my place asking if I had heard Edwin's name tied to Silas Voss. I told him to leave it alone until he had proof." Her voice caught. "I told him to be careful." Margaret felt the ache of that. How many last warnings turn into lifelong guilt for those who gave them? Adeline pressed her hands together. "After the stampede, I wondered, but wondering is not proof, and you were grieving so hard I could hardly bring you soup, much less suspicion." Margaret looked at Daniel's statement. "He wrote killed," she said softly. "Not if I die, if I am killed." Adeline closed her eyes. The kitchen lamp hissed softly. For a moment 3 ghosts seemed to sit with them: Daniel Wren, Henry Vale, Samuel Pike, who had left Adeline with a name that still hurt to speak. The living carried the papers, the dead carried the reasons. Then Nathaniel's voice came from the doorway. "Edwin Pike used rail access claims to steal land before." Margaret turned sharply. He stood braced against the frame, pale and hollow-eyed, wrapped in a blanket but upright. He should not have been standing. Of course he was. Adeline rose. "You belong in bed." "I have spent enough of my life lying still while other people suffered." Margaret's expression tightened. "You will tear that wound open again." "Likely." "Nathaniel." He looked at her, and the sound of his true name in her voice seemed to steady him. "I know Edwin Pike," he said. "Not as a friend, not personally. But Henry and I found his shadow in 3 claims across Kansas and Nebraska. Same pattern: a ranch near a rail spur, a flawed survey, a nervous clerk, a banknote called due, pressure until the owner sold cheap or lost the land in court. Pike never signed the front page. He never had to." Adeline's jaw hardened. "And Silas Voss?" "Local buyer, maybe partner. Maybe greedy fool who thinks he is using Pike while Pike uses him." Margaret looked at Daniel's papers. "Then how do we prove Daniel's death was tied to this?" Nathaniel came slowly to the table and lowered himself into the chair beside her. His breath hitched, but he held himself together through sheer will. "We may not prove the killing in the way a court wants," he said. "Not yet, but we can prove the fraud. We can prove the boundary change. We can prove the payments. If we make that public before Pike can bury it, the rest may follow." "Public how?" "Judge Rawlins first. Then the Territorial Land Commissioner. Copies in separate hands. A statement from Amos Bell if we can break his fear. And if possible, one more witness who can place Voss near the herd before Daniel's stampede." Margaret's stomach tightened. She had avoided that memory for 18 months. The sound of cattle running wild, the dust rising like smoke, men shouting, Daniel's horse coming back without him. The way the world had seemed to end while the sun stayed bright and ordinary overhead. "There was one witness," she said. Nathaniel leaned closer. "Who?" "Otis Crane, hired hand. He left 2 days after the funeral." "Where did he go?" I thought east, maybe Laramie, maybe farther. Adeline's eyes narrowed. No, not Laramie. Margaret turned. You know where he is. I treated his wife last spring. She said they were staying near Sweetwater Crossing. Quiet under her mother's name. I thought it strange at the time. Nathaniel's face sharpened with purpose. Then Otis Crane did not leave for work. He hid. From Voss? Margaret asked. Or from Pike? The house seemed to tighten around that name. Outside, a horse shifted near the barn. All three looked toward the sound. Margaret rose first and crossed to the window, careful to stand out of the lamp glow. The yard was dark now, blue-black under the snow. The barn door was shut. The gate stood still. Nothing moved except the faint swing of the lantern she had left hanging near the tack room. Then she saw a small square of white pinned to the porch post. It had not been there before. Her blood cooled. She took the rifle and went out with Nathaniel behind her despite Adeline's hissed protest. The cold wrapped around them instantly. Margaret crossed the porch and pulled the paper loose. It was folded once. No seal. No signature. Just 5 words written in blocky black pencil. Bring the papers by midnight. Below that, another line. Or the barn burns first. Margaret looked toward the barn, where every animal she owned breathed warm and innocent behind old wood. For 1 second, fear struck her so hard she could not move. Then Nathaniel took the note from her hand. His face did not show fear. It showed recognition. They are rushing now, he said. Because we found the box. Yes. What do we do? Adeline stepped onto the porch behind them, shawl pulled tight. We cannot let them burn the barn. No, Nathaniel said, and we cannot hand over Daniel's papers. Margaret stared into the dark beyond the gate. Somewhere out there, Voss was waiting. Maybe Roy Ketter. Maybe Edwin Pike himself. Men who thought threatening animals and buildings would break her quicker than threatening her own life. They did not understand what Red Lantern Ranch was. It was not only land. It was Daniel's years, her labor, her grief, her mornings alone in frost, her hands cracked from rope and wash water, her husband's name in stone. Every board, fence rail, and trough had been paid for in time that could never be returned. They want me away from the house, she said slowly. Nathaniel looked at her. Yes. And they think fear will make me bring the papers. Yes. Margaret folded the note and placed it beside Daniel's map inside her coat. Then we let them think it worked. Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. Adeline said, Margaret, no. But Margaret was already seeing the yard differently. Not as a frightened widow waiting to be struck, but as the woman who knew every shadow, every loose board, every frozen rut, every place a man could hide, and every place a horse could not pass. She turned to Nathaniel. You said men like Pike fear a story that cannot be pulled apart. They do. Then tonight we give them one. A faint spark entered his eyes despite the pain. What are you thinking? Margaret looked toward the barn, then the dark road, then the old bell beside the porch that Daniel had once used to call hands in from the far pasture. We send Adeline to Judge Rollins with the real papers. Adeline stiffened. And you? I ride to the meeting place with copies. Nathaniel shook his head. We do not have copies. Margaret looked at the account book on the kitchen table through the open door. Then we make them. For the next 2 hours, Red Lantern Ranch filled with urgent silence. Adeline copied Daniel's statement in her tight, clear hand. Nathaniel recreated the payment list as best as he could, marking every name and date, his face gray with effort. Margaret traced the map lines onto thin paper held against the window glass, using lamplight behind it until her eyes burned. Every scratch of the pen felt like a race against midnight. Once Nathaniel's hand shook so badly the ink blotted. Margaret reached over and steadied his fingers. Neither of them spoke. The touch lasted only a moment, but something passed through it. Fear, trust, apology, and the strange comfort of not being alone while danger waited outside. When the copies were done, Adeline wrapped the originals beneath her cloak. "If I am stopped," she asked. "Hide them in your medicine bag under the false bottom," Margaret said. Adeline gave her a sharp look. "You know about that." "I was a quiet woman, Adeline, not a blind one." For the first time that night, Adeline smiled. Then she took Margaret's face in both hands. "Daniel would be proud of you." The words nearly broke her. Margaret swallowed hard, "Then get his papers to the judge." Adeline left by the south trail on Margaret's mule, slow and plain like an old woman going home. No one watching the main road would think twice of her. Near midnight, Margaret saddled Juniper. Nathaniel stood beside her in the barn, coat buttoned, rifle in hand. "You are not coming," she said. "Yes, I am." "You can barely stand." "Then I will sit a horse." "You may bleed to death." He looked at her quietly. "I have spent 18 months afraid to die for the wrong reason. Tonight seems different." The words struck too deep for argument. Margaret turned away, blinking hard. "Do not make noble speeches. They do not suit you." "I will try to be less noble." "Good." A soft breath, almost like a laugh, left him. Then he touched the saddle horn to steady himself and looked at her across Juniper's back. "Margaret," he said, "if this goes badly, ride for the South Trail and do not look back." She met his eyes. "No." "Margaret, you came after me at the wash. Do not ask me to become the kind of person you refuse to be." His face softened, and for a brief moment the danger outside seemed to fall away. He looked at her not as a widow, not as a case, not as someone caught in his old war, but as a woman whose courage had found the part of him he thought was buried with Henry Vale. Before either could speak, a lantern flashed twice from the north ridge. The signal. Midnight had come. Margaret mounted Juniper, with Daniel's copied papers inside her coat. Nathaniel mounted Amos beside her, jaw tight against pain. Together they rode out through the same gate where he had collapsed bleeding only days before. Snow drifted across the road. The ranch house shrank behind them. Ahead, Voss Ridge rose black against the moon. And in the darkness near the old wash, men waited for a widow they believed was bringing them her last hope. They did not know she had already sent the truth another way. The old wash waited under the moon like a scar cut through the white land. Margaret rode toward it with Daniel's copied papers inside her coat and Nathaniel beside her, swaying slightly in the saddle but still upright. Neither of them spoke for the first mile. Words felt too small for the sound of hooves pressing into snow and the weight of what they were carrying. Behind them, Red Lantern Ranch disappeared into the dark. Ahead, the North Ridge rose black against the sky. Margaret kept her eyes forward, but she felt Nathaniel watching the land around them. Even wounded, even fevered, he noticed everything. The shadow of a fence post, the shape of brush against snow, the way a horse track cut too fresh across the old road. At the creek bend, he lifted one hand. Margaret stopped Juniper. "What is it?" she whispered. "2 riders came through here before us, maybe 3. Voss. Likely. Can we go around?" "They will have expected that." "Then what?" Nathaniel looked toward the wash. "Then we give them the thing they expect to see. A frightened widow. A brave one pretending to be frightened." Margaret's mouth tightened. "I have had practice." He looked at her, and in the pale moonlight his face showed pain and something gentler beneath it. "I know." They rode on. The meeting place was an old cattle crossing where the wash widened between 2 low banks. In spring, Water ran brown and fast there. Tonight, the ground lay hard with frost, and moonlight silvered the stones. 3 lanterns burned near the far side. Silas Voss stood in the middle. Roy Ketter waited to his left, rifle in hand. The older rider from the wash stood to his right. Behind them was Amos Bell, looking smaller than ever with his coat buttoned wrong and his hat clutched against his chest. And beside Amos stood a man Margaret had never seen before. He was older than Voss, neatly dressed despite the cold, with a black wool coat, polished boots, and a calm face that did not belong in a frozen cattle wash at midnight. He held no weapon. He did not need to. Men like that rarely dirtied their hands when other men could be paid to do it. Nathaniel's whole body changed when he saw him. Margaret felt it before she looked. "That is Edwin Pike," he said under his breath. The name moved through her like a knife pulled slow. Edwin Pike. The shadow behind Voss. The name Daniel had written before he died. The man Nathaniel had chased and failed to hold. The man tied to Henry Vale's death. So the past had come in person. Voss stepped forward as Margaret and Nathaniel stopped their horses. "You are late," he said. Margaret looked at the moon. "Midnight is midnight." His eyes went to Nathaniel. "And you brought your wounded stray." Nathaniel said nothing. Edwin Pike smiled faintly. "Mr. Cross, I confess, when I heard a quiet investigator had crawled out of the snow at Mrs. Wren's ranch, I thought it might be a rumor born from whiskey and fear." Nathaniel's hand tightened on his reins. "Pike. Still alive, then?" "No, thanks to men you hired." Pike's smile did not change, but something cold moved behind his eyes. "Careful, that sort of claim requires proof. That has always been your favorite hiding place." Margaret looked from one man to the other. The air between them was not new. It was old, bitter, and unfinished. Voss's patience thinned. "Enough, Mrs. Wren, hand over what you found." Margaret touched the papers inside her coat. "And if I do?" "Then your barn stands, your cattle sleep. You may even keep the house a while." "A while," she repeated. Voss spread his hands. "You are not fit to run the place. Everyone knows it. You have held on longer than expected, I will grant you that. But this land was always too much for a widow." The words no longer wounded her the way he meant them to. Once maybe they would have. Once, in the first months after Daniel's death, when she woke reaching for him and found only cold blankets, when she stood in the yard with men waiting for answers, and all she wanted was to hear her husband's voice. Back then, Voss's words might have slipped under her ribs. Now they only showed how little he understood. "This land was too much for thieves," Margaret said. "That is why you needed ink, lies, frightened clerks, and midnight threats." Roy raised his rifle. "Watch your mouth." Nathaniel's left hand moved toward Daniel's rifle. Pike noticed and lifted one finger. "Let us keep the evening civilized." Margaret almost laughed. Civilized, a word men used when cruelty had paperwork. Voss held out his hand. "The papers." Margaret pulled the folded copies from her coat. Amos Bell's face tightened at the sight. Good, she thought. Let him see Daniel's handwriting walking back from the grave. She held the papers out but did not dismount. "Before I give them to you, I want to know the truth." Voss scoffed. "You are not in a position to bargain." "No, but you are in a position to brag." Pike's eyes sharpened. Nathaniel shot her a brief look. He understood now. She was not just delaying, she was setting a hook. Margaret turned to Amos Bell. "Did Daniel come to you before he died?" Amos swallowed. Voss snapped, "Do not answer her." That was answer enough, but Margaret pressed harder. "He came with the corrected survey, did he not? He knew the north line had been changed. He knew the wash belonged to Red Lantern. He knew Voss was trying to steal it." Amos's hand shook around his hat. Pike's voice came smooth and soft. Mrs. Wren, grief has a way of building stories around ordinary misfortune. Was it ordinary when my husband's herd stampeded 2 days before he meant to file the correction? No one spoke. Even the horses seemed to still. Margaret looked at Voss. Did you spook them yourself, Silas, or did you pay another man to do it? Voss stepped forward, face darkening. You should be careful. Daniel was careful, he still died. The mask slipped then. Only for a second. But Margaret saw it, so did Nathaniel. Voss's eyes flashed not with surprise, but irritation. The anger of a man hearing an old secret spoken aloud when he believed it buried. You cannot prove a thing, Voss said. Margaret's heart struck hard once. There it was. Not I did not do it. You cannot prove it. Nathaniel's voice came low beside her. That was unwise. Pike turned his head slightly toward Voss, and for the first time, Margaret saw worry touch him. Voss realized too late. He took another step. Give me the papers. Margaret let the folded pages fall from her hand. They landed in the snow between them. Roy moved to grab them. Wait, Pike said sharply. But Roy had already bent down. The top page opened in the wind, showing not Daniel's original ink, but Margaret's copied hand. Voss looked from the page to her. His face went pale with fury. Copies. Margaret lifted her chin. The originals are on their way to Judge Rawlins. For one heartbeat, everything stopped. Then the wash erupted. Roy swore and raised his rifle toward Margaret. Nathaniel fired first, not at Roy's chest but at the rifle itself. The shot struck metal and wood, knocking Roy's aim wide. Roy cried out and dropped the weapon. Juniper reared beneath Margaret. She clung to the saddle horn, fighting to keep her seat. Voss lunged toward her horse, grabbing for the reins. Nathaniel drove Amos between them. The movement nearly threw him. His wounded shoulder slammed hard as he blocked Voss, and pain tore across his face. Voss reached for the pistol at his belt, but before he could clear it, a new sound rang across the wash. A bell. Not a harness bell. The old ranch bell from Red Lantern. It clanged from the ridge above them, loud and wild in the cold night. Everyone turned. Lanterns appeared along the upper bank. 1, 3, 6 more. Men rode down from the south trail, horses blowing steam, coats whipping in the wind. At their front was Judge Emmett Rawlins, broad-shouldered and stern beneath his black hat. Beside him rode Adeline Pike with her medicine bag tied to her saddle and a pistol laid across her lap like she had been born holding it. Behind them came 2 county deputies, 3 neighboring ranchers, and Otis Crane. Margaret knew him at once. Older now, thinner, fear still in his face, but there. Alive. Voss stared as if the ridge itself had betrayed him. Judge Rawlins reined in at the edge of the wash. Silas Voss, Edwin Pike, no one moves. Pike's calm face cracked for the first time. Judge, this is a private matter. Threatening a widow for evidence of land fraud is not private. Adeline lifted her chin. Neither is burning barns. Voss looked at Amos Bell, who had backed away toward the rocks. You fool, what did you do? Amos trembled, then suddenly seemed to collapse inward under the weight of years. I told them where to come. Pike turned on him. You spineless little clerk. Amos flinched but did not stop. I copied the false boundary notice. I helped hide Daniel Wren's corrected filing. I took money for it. His voice broke. But I did not know they meant to kill him. The wash fell silent again. Margaret's hands went cold around the reins. Judge Rawlins looked at Otis Crane. Mr. Crane. Otis removed his hat. He could barely meet Margaret's eyes. Mrs. Wren, I am sorry. I should have come sooner. Her throat tightened. She could not speak. Otis faced the judge. I saw Roy Ketter and another Voss hand near the south pasture the day Daniel Wren died. They were cutting open a feed sack and shaking something near the herd. I thought they were scattering salt. Then the cattle spooked. After Daniel was killed, Mr. Voss told me if I had a family worth keeping, I would forget what I saw. Roy Ketter whispered, "That is a lie." But no strength stood behind it. Nathaniel's gaze had fixed on Edwin Pike and Henry Vale. Pike's expression closed. "Do not be foolish." Nathaniel dismounted slowly, nearly falling before he caught the saddle. Margaret slid down too and moved to his side, but he kept walking until he stood several yards from Pike. "You used Voss the same way you used men in Rockford and Abilene," Nathaniel said. "You stayed behind the clean desk while local hands carried out the pressure. False surveys, bank threats, stolen water, and when Henry found the payment ledger, he died in an alley before he could testify." Pike's mouth thinned, still no proof. Adeline reached into her medicine bag and pulled out a wrapped bundle. Margaret stared. Adeline looked at Pike, and for the first time, her face held no fear of the family name she had carried like a burden. "My husband Samuel kept letters from you, Edwin. I never read them while he lived. After he died, I could not bear to. Tonight I did." Pike went still. She handed the bundle to Judge Rawlins. "They mention Rockford, Abilene, Briar Gulch, payments routed through Voss, and one line about an investigator named Vale becoming a problem." Nathaniel closed his eyes. Not in defeat. In pain so deep it almost looked like relief. Henry's ghost had finally been given a voice. Judge Rawlins nodded to the deputies. "Take their weapons." Voss's hand moved. Just slightly. One deputy raised his rifle. "Do not." Voss looked at Margaret then, hatred burning through the last of his false courtesy. "You think this makes you safe. You think land forgives. You will spend the rest of your life fighting men who want what you have." Margaret stepped forward. Snow moved around her boots. Daniel's copied papers lay at her feet. Nathaniel stood beside her, barely upright. On the ridge, witnesses held lanterns high, and for the first time in 18 months, she was not standing alone against a man's lie. "No," she said, "I will spend the rest of my life keeping what was honestly built." Voss looked away first. The deputies took him, Roy and Edwin Pike. Amos Bell, shaking and pale, gave himself up without being asked. As they were led toward the ridge, Nathaniel swayed. Margaret caught his arm. "Nathaniel, I am here." "Barely." "That still counts." She wanted to laugh. Instead, tears rose so suddenly she had to look down. Judge Rawlins approached, holding Daniel's original papers in his gloved hand. "Mrs. Wren, your husband was a careful man." "Yes," she whispered, "he was." "These will be entered into record by morning. The boundary review is suspended. The land office will be sealed until we finish the inquiry." Margaret nodded, but her eyes had moved past him. Otis Crane stood alone near his horse, hat in hand, shame keeping him small. She walked to him. He could not look up. "I should have told you." "Yes," she said. "I was afraid." "I know. My wife was carrying our second child. Voss said he knew where we slept." Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. Anger asked for harshness. Grief asked for someone to blame. But the truth was standing in front of her, tired and human and late. "You should have told me," she said again, softer this time. "But you came tonight." Otis nodded, tears shining in his eyes. "Adeline found me. Said if I ever wanted to stop being afraid of the same night, this was my chance." Margaret looked toward Adeline, who sat straight in her saddle with the cold wind, lifting her gray hair beneath her hat. "Then do not waste it," Margaret said. Otis bowed his head. Nathaniel came to her side slowly. The moment had taken nearly all the strength left in him. "You did it," he said. Margaret looked at the men being led away, at the lanterns, at Daniel's papers, at the wash where fear had tried to make its last bargain and failed. "No," she said, "we started it." His eyes searched hers. She understood why. The law had taken the men, but the heart did not heal just because a judge arrived with witnesses. Daniel was still gone. Henry was still gone. Red Lantern still had winter ahead, cattle to feed, fences to mend, and a woman who would wake tomorrow in the same house where her husband's chair waited by the table. But something had changed. Truth had crossed the threshold. And once truth entered a house, fear had less room to stand. Before the final chapter, tell me in the comments what you believe took more courage: Margaret riding into the trap with copies, or Nathaniel facing the man connected to Henry's death. Because the hardest victory is not always catching the guilty. Sometimes it is learning how to live after the truth finally comes out. The ride back to Red Lantern Ranch took place just before dawn. Adeline rode ahead with the judge and deputies. Otis followed behind, quiet as a man walking back through his own shame. Nathaniel rode beside Margaret, pale and shaking, but awake. Once, when the ranch gate came into view, he looked at it for a long time. "That gate again," he said. Margaret followed his gaze. Days ago, he had collapsed there bleeding and full of lies. Tonight, they returned through it with Daniel's truth saved, Voss defeated, and the first light of morning touching the snow. "You picked a troublesome place to fall," she said. "I have noticed." She helped him dismount. This time, he did not protest when she put her arm around him and led him into the house. At the kitchen door, he stopped. "What is it?" she asked. He looked toward Daniel's chair by the table. "I should not sit there." Margaret understood the ache beneath the words. For a long moment, she looked at the chair too. Then she guided him past it to the smaller chair near the stove. "No," she said softly, "not yet." Nathaniel nodded. "Not wounded by it. Grateful for the truth." She settled him near the fire and covered him with a blanket. As the sun rose over Red Lantern Ranch, Margaret stood at the window and watched the yard brighten. The barn still stood. The cattle moved softly in the pens. Daniel's map was safe. And for the first time since her husband died, the morning did not feel like another thing she had to survive. It felt like something she might be allowed to enter. Part 10. The first true winter storm came 3 days after Sela's Voss was taken from the wash. It came heavy and slow, not with the wild rage of a blizzard, but with the quiet weight of a sky that had finally decided to empty itself. Snow covered the north ridge, softened the wagon ruts, filled the hoofprints near the gate, and laid a white sheet over the place where fear had stood so many nights pretending it owned Red Lantern Ranch. Margaret watched it from the kitchen window, with a cup of coffee cooling between her hands. The ranch was not suddenly easy. No judge could make a winter gentle. No arrest could mend every cut fence, pay every note, or bring back every hour she had spent alone with worry sitting across from her like a second person at the table. There were cattle to feed, a barn roof to patch, a bank officer in Cheyenne still waiting for paperwork, and a land office in Briar Gulch closed under seal, while Judge Rawlins and the territorial commissioner sorted through years of rotten records. But the silence had changed. For 18 months, silence at Red Lantern Ranch had meant waiting for the next harm. Now it meant snow falling on a place still standing. Nathaniel slept in the small room off the kitchen, though sleep came to him in pieces. Adeline had stitched the torn wound again, scolded him for bleeding on good blankets, and told Margaret with grave honesty that if the man tried one more heroic ride before spring, she was to strike him with a skillet and send for her afterward. Margaret had promised to consider it. By the fourth morning, Nathaniel could sit near the stove with a blanket over his shoulders and a book in his lap he was not reading. He looked better in daylight than he had in the barn, though still too pale, too thin, too marked by old roads and older grief. Margaret set a bowl of stew beside him. "You are staring at the same page again." "I am studying it carefully. It is a seed catalog. A man can learn from seeds. You have been on the page about turnips for half an hour." A faint smile touched his mouth. "Then I expect to become very wise about turnips." The smile faded gently, not from sadness, but from lack of practice. Margaret saw that too. Nathaniel Cross had spent so long keeping watch over exits, names, and shadows that even peace felt like a room he did not know how to enter. She sat across from him. For a moment they listened to the stove pop, and the wind combed snow along the porch boards. Then he said, "Judge Rollins sent word. This morning, Adeline brought it. And the original boundary is restored until the final record is corrected. The bank cannot call the loan while the fraud inquiry is open. Amos Bell has made a full statement." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "That will help him." "Should it?" He looked up. Margaret did not say it harshly. She meant it honestly. Amos had helped Voss. He had hidden Daniel's filing. His fear had cost her more than he could ever repay. Nathaniel folded his hands around the warm bowl. "I do not know what should happen to him. I only know a frightened man telling the truth is more useful than a frightened man hiding it." Margaret looked toward the window. "Otis came by yesterday." Nathaniel waited. "He asked if there might be work here once things settle." "And what did you say?" "I said I did not know." "That was fair." "I wanted to hate him." Nathaniel's face softened. "And did you?" For a moment, she looked down at her hands. "Then I remembered what fear did to me after Daniel died. It did not make me noble every day. It made me sharp, quiet, hard to reach, sometimes unfair." "You had reason." "So did Otis." "Reasons do not erase harm." "No," she said, "but maybe they explain why a man comes late instead of never." Nathaniel was quiet for a long while. Margaret knew he was not thinking only of Otis. At last he said, "Henry used to tell me I held people to the standard of men I had not yet failed." The name Henry no longer entered the room like a knife. It still hurt him. She could hear that. But now it sounded like someone being remembered, not only someone being mourned. "What was he like?" Margaret asked. Nathaniel looked at the fire. "Younger than me, too cheerful for the work. He could charm a clerk into handing over records and make a banker think it had been his own idea. He sang badly when he was tired. He believed, foolishly, that truth made people brave." "Was he wrong?" Nathaniel's eyes moved to her. "No, just early." The answer rested between them. Margaret reached for Daniel's account book on the table. She had begun keeping it again, not as a shrine but as a working book. Feed, repairs, hired help, legal costs, weather, small numbers just as Daniel had said. A ranch was won or lost by little numbers. She opened to a clean page near the back. "I am going to write what happened," she said. "For George. For me, for Daniel. For anyone who comes after and thinks land only remembers the men who signed for it." Nathaniel watched her dip the pen. She began with the gate. Not the trial, not the fraud, not even Daniel's map. The gate. Because that was where everything had changed. A horse without a steady rider, a wounded stranger in moonlit snow, a widow with a rifle and a heart so tired of loss that she almost mistook help for danger. She wrote slowly, and Nathaniel did not interrupt. When she finished the first page, she found him looking not at the ink but at Daniel's chair. It still sat on the far side of the table. Empty. untouched by Nathaniel. Margaret followed his gaze. A week earlier, the sight of another man in that chair would have felt like betrayal. Now, the empty chair hurt in a different way. Not because Daniel was being replaced. He never could be. But because life had begun moving around the chair, and she was no longer sure grief required every place to remain frozen. "My husband was a good man," she said quietly. Nathaniel looked at her. "I know. You know pieces. I know enough to respect the rest." That answer reached her gently. She stood, took Daniel's chair by the back, and pulled it away from the table. Nathaniel started to rise, confused, but she shook her head. She carried the chair to the wall near the window, beneath Daniel's old hat and coat peg. There, it looked less like an empty seat waiting for a dead man to come home. It looked like a place of honor. Margaret stood with one hand on the chair back. "I'm not putting him away," she said. "No. I am making room." Nathaniel's eyes shone, though no tears fell. "For what?" Margaret looked around the kitchen, at the stove, the table, the account book, the door to the small room where he had fought fever, the window looking toward the gate. "For whatever comes honestly." Neither of them moved. Then Nathaniel looked down at his hands. "I do not know if I remember how to stay." Margaret returned to the table, then learned slowly. "I may still be watched. Then we will be careful. There may still be men tied to Pike who do not like what happened here. Then we will be ready. I have used more names than I care to count. I only asked for the true one." He swallowed. For a long moment, the only sound was snow sliding from the roof and landing softly outside the window. Then Nathaniel said, "My full name is Nathaniel James Cross. My mother called me Nate when she was kind and Nathaniel James when I deserved trouble. I was born outside Fort Scott, Kansas. I became an investigator because my father lost land to a forged note and died still believing the law would catch up if someone only showed it where to look." Margaret listened without moving. "I ran after Henry died because I thought stopping would mean giving them another target. But the truth is, Margaret, I was tired of being the man who survived. I called it caution because cowardice was too ugly a word to carry." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "You came back for me at the wash." His fingers tightened under hers. "Because I was more afraid of becoming the man who did not." There was no grand confession after that. No sudden promise made too big for two wounded people to carry. Just a quiet hand held across a kitchen table while snow fell around a ranch that had survived greed, grief, and the long patience of evil men. Some love begins with laughter. Theirs began with a lie, a wound, a map, and the choice to tell the truth before it was too late. Spring came late to Red Lantern Ranch that year. When it finally arrived, it did not rush. Snow pulled back from the fence posts. The wash ran clear. Grass showed first in thin green threads near the barn, then across the lower pasture. The split cottonwood put out small leaves along one living branch, stubborn as hope. The hearings lasted through March. Silas Voss lost the North Boundary claim, then much more. His ties to Edwin Pike's fraud were entered into record, and with Amos Bell's statement, Otis Crane's testimony, Adeline's letters, Daniel's map, and Nathaniel's careful reconstruction of the pattern, Voss could no longer hide behind polite words and clean gloves. He was forced to sell a wide piece of his holding, to pay legal judgments and debts that rose once his friends in the bank stopped protecting him. Edwin Pike's fall was slower, but deeper. The letters Adeline carried in her medicine bag opened old doors in 3 territories. Men who had once been afraid to speak found that one widow in Wyoming had spoken first. Cases were reopened. Claims were reviewed. Families who had believed themselves beaten began sending letters to Judge Rawlins and the commissioner, each one adding another board to the bridge Daniel Wren had started building before he died. Nathaniel testified in Briar Gulch in April. Margaret sat in the front row. He wore a dark coat borrowed from Judge Rawlins because his own still carried the stain from the night at the gate. He gave his name clearly: Nathaniel James Cross, former investigator for the Territorial Claims Office. He did not lower his eyes when Edwin Pike's lawyer tried to paint him as a drifter with grudges and false names. He admitted every name he had used, every county he had fled, every fear that had kept him hidden. Then he laid out the fraud so plainly that even men who had come to the hearing doubting Margaret left speaking of Daniel Wren's map as if it were a living witness. When he finished, he looked once toward Margaret. She did not smile. She only nodded. It was enough. That summer, Otis Crane returned to work at Red Lantern Ranch. Not as before, not easily. Trust came back like grass after hard frost, thin at first, then stronger where honest weather held. Margaret gave him work mending the south fence, and when he finished, she walked the line herself before saying, "That will do." Otis's eyes filled with gratitude. He did not speak. Adeline remained a frequent visitor. She said it was to check Nathaniel's shoulder, though she came long after it healed. She brought medicines, gossip, sharp opinions, and once a pie so hard even the barn dog refused it. Margaret told her so. Adeline said grief had stolen her patience for crust and ate 2 slices anyway. By autumn, Red Lantern Ranch no longer felt like a place under siege. It felt worked. Alive. Men came for cattle and paid fair. The loan was rewritten. The land office records were corrected. Daniel's boundary stones were cleaned and set right again. Near the split cottonwood, Margaret placed a small marker, not a grave but a memory. Daniel Wren saw the truth and left it for those who needed courage. She stood there one evening with Nathaniel beside her, the sky wide and gold over the wash. "He would have liked you," she said. Nathaniel looked uncomfortable. "I am not sure about that." He respected useful men. "That is kinder." He also disliked liars. "That is less kind." Margaret looked at him, and for once the smile came without pain behind it. "You improved." Nathaniel laughed softly. The sound surprised them both. A year after the night he fell through her gate, they rebuilt that same gate together. The old wood had carried too much: bullet-dark memories, Voss's threats, hoof scars from frightened horses, snow stains from the night Nathaniel bled beneath it. Margaret might have left it standing as proof of survival, but Nathaniel said some things deserved not to be erased but remade stronger. So they set new posts deep. Otis helped lift the crossbeam. Adeline supervised from a wagon and insulted everyone's hammering. Judge Rawlins rode by near noon, claiming he had official business on the road, though he stayed long enough for coffee and 2 slices of better pie than Adeline's. When the gate was finished, Margaret carved DW into the inside of the left post, where Daniel's name would face the ranch he had built. Nathaniel carved HV into the inside of the right post, small and neat. Henry Vale. Margaret watched him do it. His hand did not shake. Later, when the others had gone and the evening light turned the pasture copper, Nathaniel stood beside her at the gate. "I used to think remembering meant staying wounded," he said. Margaret touched the post where Daniel's initials sat. "Sometimes remembering is how a wound becomes a doorway." He looked at her then, and the long road behind his eyes seemed quieter. That winter, Nathaniel stayed. The next spring, he stayed again. No one in Briar Gulch called him Eli Ransom. No one at Red Lantern Ranch needed the name. He was Nathaniel Cross, the man who had arrived as a stranger, fought like a guilty soul seeking mercy, and remained as someone learning that peace was not the absence of danger, but the presence of a place worth defending. As for Margaret, people stopped calling her the poor widow of Red Lantern. Not because she married again quickly, she did not. Not because Nathaniel saved her, he had not saved her alone. They stopped because the story grew larger than pity. She became the woman who carried copies into a trap while the truth rode another road. The woman who found her husband's map and did not let fear bury it twice. The woman who kept the ranch, not by begging men to be fair, but by making the truth too visible for them to ignore. Years later, when children would ask about the marks inside the gate, Margaret would tell them, "One is for the man who built this place. One is for the man who helped me keep it. And both are reminders that a good name does not die when honest people carry it forward." She and Nathaniel did marry, but not until another full year had passed. It happened in the yard at Red Lantern Ranch, with the gate open, the split cottonwood green in the distance, and Daniel's chair placed near the porch with his hat resting on it, not as a shadow over the day, but as a blessing allowed to remain. Nathaniel made no vow about replacing what had been lost. Margaret would not have accepted it. Instead, he promised to stand beside what was true, to never again let fear choose his road for him, and to speak his name honestly in whatever storm found them next. Margaret promised him the same. When the ceremony ended, Adeline cried and denied it. Otis shook Nathaniel's hand too long. Judge Rawlins said it was the finest legal arrangement he had witnessed all year, which earned him a look from Margaret sharp enough to silence him. At sunset, Margaret walked alone to the gate for a moment. The sky burned soft pink and gold over the Wyoming hills. Cattle moved in the pasture. The barn stood warm with lamplight. The house behind her no longer felt empty, though it still remembered. She placed one hand on Daniel's initials, then one hand on Henry's. Two dead men, two unfinished truths, two living hearts that had carried their names out of the dark. Nathaniel came to stand beside her, but did not speak. He had learned the value of silence when it was shared, instead of hidden inside. Margaret looked down the road where his wounded horse had once stumbled through the snow. She thought of the woman she had been that night, rifle in hand, grief in her bones, certain that mercy might cost her everything. In a way it had. It had cost her the lonely safety of never trusting again. It had cost Nathaniel the false safety of never staying. And what they received in return was not a perfect life, not an easy one, but an honest place where grief and love could sit at the same table without fighting for the only chair. If this story touched your heart, like it and subscribe for more emotional Wild West tales where courage, love, and justice meet on the frontier. And tell me in the comments, would you have opened the gate that night for a wounded stranger? As the last light faded, Margaret closed the new gate gently. Not to shut the world out. Only to mark the place where one life had ended, another had begun, and two wounded souls had learned that sometimes the road to healing rides through the very gate we are most afraid to open.